find out about that, and it will be worth. And then hopefully, as we get into that, then maybe we can talk a bit about atheism and theism and that as well. We can jump into that.
Yeah.
But Raz, yeah.
It is Raz, yes.
So Raz, yeah. Let me know. One of the things you were saying was I'll let you just.
No,
Yeah.
I suppose the issue I was really trying to raise is that don't feel like you have to don't be intimidated by those who support Israel. Always get your point across in terms of supporting Palestine. Because if we were to look back at history of, and I don't call it a conflict because it's not a conflict, I see, a superpower supported by the only superpower in the world against the people that have got nothing, no army, no air force, no rights, and are stuck in a land. So it's not a conflict of two equal sides. It simply isn't. But don't be intimidated by them. Speak on behalf of Palestine and get your points over. And I think it's important to concentrate on, the ethnic cleansing, the apartheid, and their lack of rights. They'll always try to deflect you in terms of, Hamas, the rights to exist, and all the rest of that nonsense. But if you keep it tight and keep it on those grounds and talk about ethnic cleansing and apartheid, they've got nowhere to go, and they haven't got a leg to stand on.
Yeah.
So if they try to divert you away from that, bring it back to that, because that's what will get them, and it'll get them every single time.
So Raz, a lot of people get worried and they're worried about the employment and the likes, but you said that even though they've threatened you with, I'll upload it in 2 days, it hasn't phased you. Why
No,
is
it hasn't phased me in the slightest, because it's interesting when they say that, because for those who support Israel and support Zionism, they never seem to be threatened in terms of their careers and their future prospects. So how is it that they're never threatened, but if you support Palestine, you are threatened? So again, I think it's just another way to deflect from what Israel is doing. So it's just, don't be intimidated by it. Still speak out. And even if you don't want to speak here, there are other ways of campaigning. You can do it through social media. You can do it by attending marches. There's other ways of doing it as well. So if you're not comfortable here, then look into other ways of doing it. There are various ways of doing it. You can support Palestine. You don't have to be like me and come here. That's fine. I understand it can be an intimidating atmosphere for certain people.
Yeah.
But then do it other ways. There's other ways you can do it. You can support it by leafleting and that sort of thing, and going on marches peacefully, and do it that way.
Raz, I'm sure you're familiar with this.
I know, I'm well aware of that.
So Raz, firstly, hopefully when this goes up, because Palestinians, whenever they're not getting bombed, and they do have time to see what the rest of the world is saying, I'm sure they'll come across this, and I'm sure they'll appreciate your support as well. And I would say it is a sacrifice. It is a sacrifice because you do take time out. You have learned about the conflict.
Absolutely.
And you do, there's some tissue there. You do, obviously, you're cautious with how you articulate your arguments, because you know the law, and you're not being silly when you say certain things. So that in itself requires a sort of effort that you have gone through, and I'm sure many people watching will appreciate this, frankly.
Thank you.
I think they will. So Raz, I mean, talk about your journey so far in terms of like theology, like where have you been? What's the journey been like for you? And
yeah, well, you'd mentioned that I don't follow a faith, and I don't, but my situation was slightly different because I was born into a Muslim family, but my parents never introduced religion into the household. So we never had religion. I never went to a mosque, church, synagogue, none of that. And I grew up in the north of England, in Bradford of all places.
No way.
So you can imagine growing up in Bradford and not going to a mosque and not having religion in your house, but that's how it was for me. And so as I grew up, as I became an adult, it kind of stayed with me. I thought, well, I've not had religion up until this point, and so it just followed through my adult life, and I've never followed it. And hence why I never followed any religion, but that's what it is really. It's just because it was never introduced into my household. And that was it was a difficult environment to grow up in, especially in a city like Bradford, because it's got a large Muslim community, and if you're kind of like the standouts, people thinking, hold on a second here, we don't see you at the mosque on a Friday, and it's a bit sort of, and I just thought to myself, well, it's just, my parents never introduced it, so yes, we're a little bit different, but that's just the way it is. And so,
You had Muslim friends, you'd hang out?
oh God, yes. Well, obviously, growing up in Bradford, all my friends were mainly Muslim or Hindu or Sikh. But I was, I suppose, the odd one out, if I can put it that way, in terms of I never followed any faith. It's interesting actually, because a lot of my friends now, obviously, who are much older now, they now don't follow any faith, strangely enough. They've kind of turned away from religion.
Really?
Yeah, which I found really quite strange. Not because of me, because I don't pressurise anybody. I respect anybody who follows religion, because it's important to people. So I'm not here to belittle it in any way. It's just never been important in my life. And now I'm in my 50s. I'm an old man now, but I suppose it never will be. But you never know. One day it might change. But so that's really my story, because it was never introduced. I never kind of followed it through as I became an adult, and I've kind of just sort of gone that way. But yeah.
Are you familiar with the Islamic argument for God, or the arguments that Muslims put forward, and what do you think about them?
Actually, if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm actually not. So it'd be interesting to see what you have to say about that, because it's not something I've ever discussed at length with individuals, to be perfectly honest.
So there's obviously many arguments that you can take, but let's just start with the rudimentary one of design.
Yes.
So what do you think when you look at the design that you see around you?
Yes.
Typically it gets distilled into three conclusions. It came from nothing, came by chance, or there was an agency that formed everything that we see.
Yeah, this has always been a very, very difficult one for me, because I think at times I've switched between the three. I've never been quite certain as to what it could be. And if I'm being completely honest, even now, I'm still not sure what the answer is for me. I'm thinking...
Assalamu alaikum, brother. You're right. I remember you.
Yeah, so... I wish I could give you a definitive answer, but I'm actually really still not sure.
Where are you now, like 50 years into life?
Yes.
Where are you pitching your tent? Most likely, if you were to kind of reflect, like, where do you think it comes from? Maybe we can explore all three,
Yeah. I don't think it came about by chance. I think that would be, I don't know, it doesn't... I've never been completely comfortable with them. But then I go from that and thinking, well, where could it have come from? And that's when I think, well, actually, I'm not sure. I'm saying to myself, I don't think it came about by chance, but then I'm not sure how it came about. And I'm thinking, it's quite a, I'm just not sure. I'm not sure if I'm being completely honest. I'm not sure.
So chance seems unlikely to you?
To me, it seems unlikely. Unless, there are people here that have said to me, look, it's completely by chance, and I'm thinking, I'm not sure.
So do you have a bit of doubt that it could be by chance? So we can start with that point, and I can give you
No, I don't think it was by chance. I genuinely don't. But I'm not sure. But then, like I said, at the same time, I'm not sure where life came from.
No problem. We'll just take
Yeah.
one step and just see where you pitch your tent.
Yes,
and we'll
yes.
see where it goes.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I don't know if you've seen the sitcom Friends.
I have.
And
yes.
they're like, I think when Chandler was getting married and he was getting overwhelmed, Ross said, look, just put on your jacket. Just walk out the door. Just take one step and we'll see where it leads.
I remember when he got married. I don't remember the scene, but yes.
Yeah, he was hyperventilating and he was like,
right, okay.
It's going to be one for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So Raz, over here, then the other option would be nothing. Do you believe it comes from nothing?
No, I don't, because I think that would be rather downplaying it, if I can put it that way. It would seem rather strange. No, I don't believe that, no.
So Raz, even when you look into philosophy and you look at who's discussed these questions and these notions, naturally we come to philosophers like Aristotle, Plato,
Yes.
Leibniz, Descartes,
Yes.
Hegel,
Yeah.
Berkeley and the likes, and Professor John Lennox says, and you can read their philosophical papers, which are incredibly boring, but so each to their own. Important, of course. But they all accept that there was a transcendental entity But the question is, what is the nature of the identity? Is that where you
Yes, and I
similar
think
with?
that's a good way of summing it up, really.
Okay.
That they agree that there was, but then what kind of led to that? Yes,
was
I
it?
agree.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
So, do you believe that the entity would be singular as opposed to plural?
شوف انا اقول لك شيء هو لما المسلمين لا تصنع لما المسلمين راحوا غزوه تبوك.
I'm not sure, to be quite honest. I'm not sure.
Okay, let me.
I'm not sure.
No problem. So, typically in philosophy, what they look into is they look at the nature of being.
Yes.
That we are beings that are dependent.
Yes.
We depend on something that depends on something. Now there's two options. Either the chain goes on for infinity,
Yes.
or there is an end to that chain, which philosophers call a necessary existence. Aristotle called it the prime mover or the cause of all causes. Ibn Sina and Ibn Taymiyyah and the likes, they of course refer to it as a necessary existence. And then that's making sense so far?
Yeah, absolutely.
So because obviously an infinite regress leads to it's an impossibility, doesn't make sense, it's only in maths.
Yeah.
So that leads to a singular as opposed to a plural.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm following you.
So
yeah.
everything can be distilled into a singular thing from which everything is dependent upon. So that singular thing would be definitionally one,
Yes.
and also definitionally I would argue independent, because everything is
Yeah.
dependent
of course,
upon
yeah,
it.
Yeah.
And by definition also, it would not be a thing that was given birth to and nor gives birth itself.
Gives birth itself. Yeah.
And naturally, because it's a singular and it's unlike all the dependencies, nothing can be like it.
Yes. That which makes sense. I think. Yeah. That seems reasonable. Yeah.
So Raz, according to Muslims, in chapter 112 of the Quran, that's literally our definition of God. Like you can see with this deranged woman who's saying that Jesus is a man. We don't believe God was a man. We don't believe God was a tree. We don't believe God is an... He was right about that.
Yeah. We can agree on that.
We don't believe God is an older man with a beard. We don't believe he's an elderly man who has made other godlings and sends thunderbolts, because anything within the universe, Raz, is subject to the laws of the universe, which is, of course, time and space.
Yeah.
So God has to be outside of time and space, or the independent existence that we call God has to be outside of time and space for it not to be enslaved by the laws of the universe.
And that makes sense.
Fantastic.
Yeah. It needs to be outside, of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Raz, quite simply, that's our definition of God. Yeah. Would you now say, if we were to now give it other qualities, would you say that there is an immense amount of knowledge in the universe?
I would say yes. Yeah.
And would you also accept that knowledge begets knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the necessary existence has to be very incredibly knowledgeable.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense.
And by extension, when you look at the intricacies of design that we see in the world, when you see the intricate nature of the ecosystems and the cells and the DNA and how they intertwine with each other, you would also say it makes sense if the necessary existence is wise.
Yes. Yeah.
And as an extension, as a peripheral question, would you believe, Raz, that as human beings, after creating us, or after forming us, would the Creator abandon us, or would he guide us? Which of the two makes more sense?
Definitely guiders, I would suggest.
Okay, fantastic.
I don't think there'd be an abandonment. I think that wouldn't make any sense.
Absolutely. Because it would go against the principle of wisdom.
Exactly.
Because you don't claim, if a painter is painting on a canvas and he's painting without a purpose, it's not necessarily the sign of somebody that is intelligent. That's
Yeah.
somebody that's
Yeah. No,
doing
it's not.
something with
Yeah,
intentionality.
yeah, no, absolutely not. No.
So bearing that in mind, Raz, when you see that, how would you think, in your understanding, God would bridge the gap between knowledge to us? What would be an ideal form of bridging that gap?
Well, well, in terms of, I suppose if I was to sum it up quite simply, I would say teaching us right from wrong, really, in terms of how each of us would live our lives.
Through which medium do you think that would?
Well, I suppose it would make more sense if it was through the teachings of, let's say, for example, I don't like to use the word God, but if we said God, for example, through the teachings of Him, through His holy book.
Okay.
People here will talk about the Quran or the Torah or the Bible, but it would make sense that it would come through His teachings, and
Okay.
hopefully that would then lead for us to lead the lives that would make more sense. Would not be detrimental to our existence. We would
Fantastic.
that we would live amongst
Absolutely.
ourselves peacefully.
Absolutely. So Raz, let's just say we've got 4 holy books in front of us.
Yes.
Yeah. What would be your criteria, bearing in mind using logic and rationality, trying to be as impartial as possible?
Yes.
What would be your criteria for a book to be from God or from a creator?
Yes. If I was to think about it logically, I would say a book that, I suppose, in terms of what I've just said, a book which doesn't want to separate, say, person A from person B, but is about actually living together in peace and not creating tension between individuals.
Okay.
So that's how I would see it, a book which, cause I know people argue that the Quran doesn't do that and it does split people, but I don't believe it does. I don't believe any holy book sets out intentionally to do that. But that would be my criteria for it to be
So number 1, cohesion.
cohesion is massively important. To
Good.
me, yeah.
Number 2, bear in mind we need to prove that this book is from God.
Yes.
So there has to be a way for us to measure it. So we're looking at things to measure the veracity and the authenticity of this book.
Well, the authenticity would be what people would take from that book. So let's say, for example, a person read, say, the Quran, for example, but then didn't follow the teachings of within that book, then that would make no sense to me, because then they're not really following that particular book, so that would make no sense. So you would see it through their intentions in terms of how they live their life, is how I would measure it.
Okay.
So
number 2, the adherence. You'd
yeah,
measure it by the adherence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Number 3.
This will be a difficult one for me, but I would say not to enforce that opinion on other people.
Okay.
So it's fine for an individual to believe that and to follow it, but not to enforce it onto anyone else.
Okay.
So I'm not sure how you would sum that up, but I would think that would be important to me.
Okay, fantastic. Now, of course, there are loads of books,
Yes.
and they claim that it's from God,
Yeah.
and some have wonderful teachings within them, very cohesive.
Yeah.
However, a criteria. Let me know if you if you believe or you accept this as a viable criteria. One would be preservation. Because if a book claims to be from thousands of years ago, if you can't prove that it's the same book from that time and it's been changed, then you don't know if the teachings that are currently in that book
Are the teachings of the original? Absolutely, yes, I would agree with that.
preservation, yeah?
Preservation is massively important.
And
yeah.
would you also accept that if there are internal claims, the internal claims should be measurable externally from the book? Otherwise, it's just a circular argument, like the Quran and the Bible is true because it says that it's true.
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
Yeah?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Yeah. And that's the way it should be measured, I feel.
Yeah,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
So when it comes to the Quran, just looking at the criteria that you said, there's I'll come to that a bit later on. But when it comes to preservation, Raz, from the ancient religions, the Quran is the only one that has a manuscript dating to the time of preservation. sorry, dating to the time of revelation and compilation.
Yes, because the others have been changed in essence, haven't they? Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah, this is where I think those who follow the Quran are on very strong standing here, because I don't think any other religion can debate that point, because it's historical fact, isn't it? So you can't debate it, which is where, I think that's where I think Islam is on a particular strong footing, because it is all about preservation,
Yes.
and it hasn't been changed. You can go back and it hasn't been changed.
Absolutely.
Or where other religions, I think, there's a people have looked at it in a different way, or like the Old Testament to the New Testament, and I think that's where it falls down there. Well, you can't really say that about Islam, because
Yes.
that original text has been preserved. So I think that I would agree with you completely there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point. I think people tend to overlook that, actually.
They do,
Yeah.
they
the
do.
preservation point, they tend to just sort of overlook, and then they'll bark on about something which is irrelevant, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they'll go to moral arguments.
Yeah,
and,
they'll tend to go down the moral
absolutely.
route. Yes,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the oldest manuscript of the Quran is actually in University of Birmingham, and it's been carbon dated by the University of Oxford.
I didn't know.
Yeah.
Is it real? I honestly
Yeah.
didn't know that.
There's 4 folios, and it's in the Mingana collection. It's called the Cadbury Mingana collection. It can be viewed if you're in Birmingham.
Yeah.
Make sure to
I
take a look.
will.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But,
It's been dated to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and when you compare the text of those 4 folios with the text of the Quran today, there's 100% word accuracy.
yes. What I would say, though, by coming here, what I've noticed is, and I genuinely say this, as you know, as someone who follows no faith, there seems to be more criticism of Islam than any other faith. And they tend to use that rather ridiculous argument about Muhammad and the marriage and the child, that normal nonsense. And I just think, is that the strongest argument you have?
You see?
And I see that a lot here. And I step back, and obviously I can step back because of who I am as a person and the fact that I don't follow any faith. And I just think it's such a ridiculous argument to bring forward to justify your faith.
Yeah.
Whether it's Christianity or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
It just seems like such a, I don't know how to really sum it up, but it's just ridiculous in its nature, and it's almost cruel, and just, it's, they almost want to stereotype the whole faith just in respect of what they concede, what may have happened.
Well, they underestimate people like you that, when you hear stuff like this and you can distinguish between fact and emotion.
absolutely.
And let's face it, I mean, people that look into fact and, they're interested in the actual functioning behind the empiricism and the ontology.
Absolutely.
We're not interested in emotion, with all due respect.
No, absolutely
We
not.
take the whole stoic approach, like bring the facts and bring the evidences and let me make up my own mind.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
And I think that's what people should do. Look at the evidence and make up your own mind.
Yeah.
But I think there seems to be more, and I don't know if you agree with this, there seems to be more hatred of Islam here than any other faith. I've seen that for years, and I just think, but yet people will come here and claim that, it's the Muslims that have taken over the whole of Speaker's Corner, and they're enforcing your faith on you. And I'm thinking, hold on here, that's just not what's happening here. Because if you genuinely come here and actually look at if you listen to the comments of the people here, there's definitely more hatred towards Islam. There is no doubt about it, and I see it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, Georgia State University, it concluded that whenever a quote-unquote Muslim does a attack, when a Muslim does a terrorist attack, there's 4.5 times more coverage than if a non-Muslim was to do that attack.
Yeah, and I think that's very true. And what I've also noticed is that it is classed as terrorism, but if I say the West reacts to it, it's then seen as counter-terrorism. And you see, the language is important to me. So I'm saying, hold on, so you're saying that if the Muslims commit what you consider an act of terror, you describe it as terrorism. But then if you go into Iraq and Afghanistan, that's considered counter-terrorism.
Yeah.
How does that make sense? You've killed 1 million people in Iraq and you consider that counter-terrorism?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's the language about the Muslim community and
Yeah.
about Islam that I disagree with and I always fight against as well. Because language is important, the words that you use
Yes.
is important. So one is terrorism and that's counter-terrorism. I don't agree with that. That's
Absolutely,
more of a terror. What you're doing is certainly, that's terrorism. You know, and to class it as counter-terrorism, I think is just absolute nonsense. And I think it was a Jewish chap in the US who described it as the West described the West only used terrorism to describe activities that they disagree with.
Yeah,
And I thought that was a wonderful way of putting it. Do you see the point?
Yeah.
They'll only ever use that term to describe something that they disagree with.
Absolutely.
But when they do it, it's okay, it's counter-terrorism.
Case in point, Nelson Mandela. I mean,
Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, he was called a terrorist, but he was called a freedom fighter.
Up until 2009, he was actually classed as a terrorist by the United States.
Absolutely.
Up until 2009, that was only 16 years ago.
It's interesting you say
The
2009.
language is really important. Right?
Because from 2008 to 2013, the University of California and CAIR CARE, they looked into the funding, the Islamophobia industry, and they concluded in the US, $200 million have been spent by $200 million have been spent by about 74 organizations to put forth Islamophobia in the US.
Oh, it is. When I was in Washington 6 months ago, I walked down Pennsylvania Avenue, and there's a number of organisations on that avenue, literally 5 minutes from the White House. I went back to my hotel and I took down all the names of these organisations. Honestly, this is a true story. I went back to my hotel and I looked into what all these organisations stood for, and they're exactly what you've just said. They were all about pushing the Zionist narrative and pushing the Muslim hate. Every single one of them. I looked into their funding, where they got their funding from, which group sponsored them, and it was all for that. It was all about spreading the hate towards the Islamic faith and supporting the Zionist cause. And that's literally 5 minutes from the White House. All these organisations are on that street and they were all doing the same thing. I literally wrote all the names down and I went and did some research. And I think that's what you're up against.
Yeah.
As followers of the Islamic faith like yourself and other people, this is what you're up against.
Yeah.
You're up against language that's used mainly by Western governments to support what they're doing. But yet, if you do anything, it will automatically be considered as terrorism. And the point we made earlier in regards to Palestine, that again is described as terrorism by the US.
Yes.
But we all know that if a Christian country was going through that, the word terrorism would not be used. And they would not be asked, do they support their right to resist? They wouldn't be asked that question. So again, it's the language. And I think this is where the Muslim faith are always up against it, or those who follow the faith are always up against it. You almost have to overly justify your position, where I don't see other faiths having to do that. Unless that's what I read from coming.
It's true. I mean, even like they mentioned that you mentioned the issue about the Prophet and his marriage, but within their own scriptures, they also acknowledge that Rebecca was 3 when she was married. They also acknowledge in the Christian, the Catholic Encyclopedia, Mary was 13 when she was married.
That's right.
And 12 when she was pregnant. So they don't mention these things, Raz.
No.
However, they'll mention violence when it comes to the Quran, but the Quran never mentions one verse that says it's okay for you to kill babies.
Exactly.
But 1 Samuel 15 verse 3, which is referring to Amalek, and exactly that verse that Benjamin Netanyahu, when he was in front of the cameras, he said Amalek.
Yeah, and he didn't use, that wasn't by coincidence, because if you actually read what Amalek is all about, it's about killing not only the children, the fathers, the mothers. It's also about killing livestock.
Yeah.
He knew what he was talking about,
Yes.
which is why he used the term.
Yeah.
If people actually go and actually read what Amalek was all about, it was the destruction of everything around us, not just the children.
Yeah, the sheep,
the sheep,
the
nothing,
camel,
nothing was
the
spared.
donkeys.
The donkeys, even the donkeys.
Like, why the donkeys?
This is not, yeah, why
You
the
only get the
donkeys?
sheep,
Yeah.
get the sheep, but not the donkeys.
You're going to upset me if you mention the donkeys. But this is why he uses that term. See, again, it's the language they seem to use. It seems to be acceptable if they use language in a certain way, but not acceptable if you try to defend not just the Palestinian people, but any people that are resisting an occupation.
Yeah.
It seems that you're always in the wrong, and that's why you're up against it. Because people always often accuse Muslims of supporting Palestine because they're Muslims. Well, they're seeing their fellow Muslims being murdered.
Yeah.
What do you expect them to do? Of course, there's a direct link there because they're seeing their own Muslims being murdered.
Absolutely.
Would Christians not do the same thing? If we saw 20,000 Christian kids being murdered in the last 18 months,
Yeah.
are you genuinely trying to tell me that the Christian community around the world would not stand up against that?
Yeah.
But it would seem that the Muslim community are not allowed to do that.
Yeah.
But it's these
Hypocrisy,
it's these double standards. You see, this is what I'm saying.
So Raz, I mean, that's a very good point. You're noticing that when it comes to argumentation, we've got good argumentation when it comes to logic and rational evidences.
Absolutely.
However, you're correct to say that when they struggle to give similar evidences for their faith, they just go to kind of moral arguments.
It's the moral
yeah.
arguments because that's all they've got left.
That's all they've got.
And again, that's when you know you've got them.
Absolutely.
Because they can't seem to argue beyond that point, about.
So Raz, when it comes to the Quran, we said the preservation, but
Yes.
there are accuracies even in terms of language and preciseness. For example, there's one example I wanted to use today, which is you see that it's obviously raining,
Yeah.
and if there are that cloud over there, would you say it's heavy or light?
Light.
Light. But the Quran explicitly says and calls clouds heavy. And if
Right, I didn't know that.
yeah, it says heavy clouds. Now, if you were to Google it whenever you get a chance, what is the weight of an average cloud? And I kid you not, Raz, it's 500 tons.
You learn something new every day,
It's,
don't you?
it's mad, isn't it?
I didn't realise that.
And to be
honestly.
fair, even I was like,
500, I can't believe that.
you know, when you're on the aeroplane and you see they're just wisping and just being
Just whisper away, yeah.
like the wind wherever it takes it.
Right.
So that was one example of precise language. Another one is when the Quran says, and it's referring to a spider spinning a web, it refers to the spider in the feminine. So the female spider spinning the web.
Right. Okay.
And which is a bit strange, like somebody that is looking to disprove Islam, they would immediately say, let me research this, the Quran is inaccurate. But upon checking it, Raz, they will see that it's only the female spider that spins the web.
And that is actually true.
Yeah.
That is actually factually true.
And one thing that even our interlocutors will accept is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was unlettered, like he couldn't read or write.
Yes, that's right. No.
He was in the desert,
Yep.
and only less than a handful of times he left Makkah. So he didn't necessarily have access to the knowledge that was outside.
No.
And somebody that's unlettered, somebody who's getting revelation, which we believe was circumstantial,
Yes.
and which we believe didn't come in order. So bearing all of this in mind, Raz, when you look at, for example, the spider being called and addressed by the feminine, the clouds being called heavy, and also when Allah talks about the orbit, the celestial objects orbiting, it says and refers to them swimming in their orbit. Now, a person might say, this is very basic, rudimentary language, but upon, inquiring upon this, and if you look in NASA, for an astronaut to be ready to go to space, they have to be good at swimming. And that's why they have an Olympic-sized swimming pool, with 3 times the size of an Olympic-sized swimming pool, to simulate what they will be, the movements that They will
Once they're
go
up
through
there, yes.
exactly.
Ah.
Yes, and they have to do it in a pool. And it's amazing, isn't it? So a man in
And
the
this is from
desert,
a man who could not read and
yeah,
write.
he could not read or write.
No, and that's well known.
Absolutely,
That's well
absolutely.
known,
And this is something that
Yeah,
they
yeah.
they feel that it's against us, but we say, with all due respect, this is against you. Because if you look at the immense amount of precision in the Quran, to such a degree, even if you look mathematically, Surah Baqarah is the second chapter of the Quran,
Yes.
and it has 286 verses.
Right.
If you half that, you get 143.
Yeah.
And if you go to the verse that's halfway through, it's Allah says, "We have created you as the middle ummah, wasat, the middle ummah." So even when you look at mathematical intricacies, for example, when Allah talks about we have made Jesus in the likeness of Adam. Yeah, I'm paraphrasing, mentioning that they're both very similar. They have been mentioned a similar amount of time, the same amount of times in the Quran, about 27 times. And Raz, when you look at, okay, this is an individual that was receiving revelation, that's the claim. However, his words are precise. Like another claim is, Raz, it was copied by the Bible, from the Bible.
Oh yeah, you get that a lot. Yeah.
But the Bible, when it talks about the leaders at the time of Joseph, the Bible says pharaohs. Pharaohs were the ruling dynasty at the time of Joseph. But the Quran doesn't say that. It says kings at the time of Joseph.
Yeah.
Now, that was 1,000 years before the Rosetta Stone was discovered, when
Yes.
the Quran made this claim.
Which is when, yeah.
And when the Rosetta Stone was deciphered, they actually agreed with the Quran, which is there were no pharaohs at the time of Joseph. It was the king dynasty.
I didn't know. That's
You
really
see?
interesting.
So Raz, the
You really
more,
opened up my eyes.
yeah, the more you look into it, Raz, the more you realize that this is no average book. And Raz,
Oh, it's certainly not that. No.
even when you take a walk through the park or Leicester Square or
I've seen you in Leicester Square, by the way.
oh, really? Oh. Well, now obviously we'll be able to share greetings. That was probably, yeah. So Stratford Hill as well. These are places where typically Muslims are there
Yes.
just sharing Islam.
Yeah.
But you notice they give away the Quran for free.
Yes, they do in Leicester Square. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Have you ever seen a Hindu on a table giving out copies of the Vedas?
No.
Because they believe only the priestly class, only they can read and only they can be taught and read the Vedas, not the lower castes.
Yeah, not the lower caste. Yeah.
Same and similar with the Old Testament also. You had the rabbis that were responsible for the Old Testament more so than the lower ones. That's why we say that it was as if they had taken them to be their gods.
Yes.
And of course, I mean, I don't need to say much about the Bible. The King James Version, the Protestant Bible has 66 books. The Catholic Bible has 73 books.
Yes, there's a difference. Yes.
Yeah, the Greek and Orthodox 79 books, and the Ethiopian one has 81 books.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And Raz,
It's not in tandem, is it?
It's not in tandem.
And that's an important distinction.
absolutely, because here's the thing, Raz,
Because
that
it goes back to your preservation point.
yes,
It goes back to that, you see. Because again, they can't argue, can they? Different chapters, depending on it makes no sense. But
so here's the interesting thing, Raz. They go to this Sunni Shia thing, but we say whether you're Sunni, whether you're Shia.
you know that was going to be my next question to you.
Yeah,
Honestly,
yeah.
it was.
Yeah,
Because they
yeah.
always go to that.
They do.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, Raz. They say Sunni Shia, but regardless of whether you're Sunni, whether you're Shia, even the sect that we don't even accept that they're Muslim, the Qadianis or the Ahmadiyya,
Yeah.
Raz, all of them accept and believe in the same Quran.
Yeah, and that's the difference, isn't it?
That's absolutely.
They fought their wars between each other, but they all do believe in the same Quran, and that you can't get away from.
So here's the thing, here's the issue that I have with the Christians, because the King James Version was written in 1611, around that time.
Yeah.
And when it was written in 1611, it had verses that are not present in the Bible that we have today.
Yes, that's right.
Many verses,
No,
like
it's
the
quite-
last,
yeah,
like the
yeah.
last 12 verses of Mark,
Yeah,
which are taken out.
yeah.
Why? Because they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, not the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls is more for the Old Testament,
Yeah.
but the Codex Sinaiticus is the earliest manuscript, and the King James version did not take that into consideration. And reason being, Raz, now they say, because the New International Version has many verses missing, and they say that's more authentic than the King James Version. My question is, what if someone has taken the King James Version and, is somebody that likes traveling, likes going and living in the mountains, and, like I saw this video yesterday of someone in Kazakhstan just, pitching a tent on the side of a stream, with mountains and just, just in that wildlife.
Yeah.
If he has the misfortune of having the King James Version of the Bible, then do you see?
Yeah, I see your point. Yeah, absolutely.
Because the last 12 verses of Mark say stuff like, if you're a believer, you should be able to handle snakes. And there is a group that have gone to the mountains called the Appalachians, and they try to handle snakes to their detriment, Raz. And they died. But the modern Christian would say, no, those verses have been taken out. But I say, how can this be a word from God when it is relying upon human written manuscripts and human related collation?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
it's not right, Raz.
It's not right. No, I agree. It's not
And
right.
when certain people are filtered out, these people are responsible for scripture. Well, you and I both know human beings are, slaves to our desires, to power, to